Hi, this is Mark Griffin, Director of Customer Solutions here at Construx. We're a team of software engineering experts led by legendary author Steve McConnell. Here we believe every software team can be more successful at delivering high levels of business value. Every episode, we talk with one of our consultants, exploring different types of engagements. We describe the issues those engagements are designed to address and how we solve them. And we have a little fun along the way, so let's get to it. Today, we are joined by Construx Senior Fellow Erik Simmons, who comes to us from what, in his view, is the beer capital of the universe, Portland, Oregon. Erik is a Senior Fellow with Construx. He has more than 30 years of experience as a systems and software engineer, consultant, and change agent, both in the public and private sector. Erik is internationally recognized for his expertise in areas such as agile transformation, software and systems life cycles, solution thinking, complex adaptive systems engineering, and requirements engineering. Beyond his work life, Erik is an accomplished organist with more than a dozen CD recordings. Don't believe me? Check out his YouTube channel. Welcome, my friend. Welcome to the machine.
Thanks. And that's not just my opinion about Portland beer, but I'll stand for it.
You know, we could have, that's a whole nother podcast. We
or
could
three.
Have that whole conversation. Absolutely. So today we're going to be exploring one of the high-value offerings that Construx consultants perform on a pretty regular basis, and that's this idea of organizational assessments. And we're going to explore that with three kind of main focus points today. Kind of what are they? What are they? Why are they important and useful to businesses is the first topic we're going to hit. And so, I think what we should do is just kind of define terms here, because sometimes this particular phrase has assumed a pejorative among the consultancy space out there. And so what do we mean when we say an organizational assessment, Erik?
Yeah, it's true that the assessment word has been kind of sullied in many places. What we mean by that is a series of activities over about 2 months. The total duration depends on the ability of an organization to schedule things and whether we do on-site interviews or remote, things like that. But normally 1 to 2 months. And we look very specifically at software engineering practices, but not just that. Depending on the organization and where it sits in its life and its evolution, we'll look at a bunch of other things, including the organizational structure, the architecture of the system, the way people communicate, all the way down to whether or not teams can trust each other.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that sentiment. I mean, you like to talk about, in some cases, assessing trust and cultural issues in addition to technical issues, right?
I certainly do, because, when a team comes up and says, we're having trouble with some practice, sometimes that's simply a matter of correcting the practice. But more often than not, there's more to it than a simple correction to a practice, because the correction itself won't stick if it's being made in an environment where it has no chance of success, right? So if the culture is off in the deep end somewhere, or if nobody trusts each other, or if they're getting incentives from management to do exactly the opposite of the improved practice, then it's not going to stick. So we can't just look at technical practices and call it a day.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good example. I mean, I like to use the phrase of a lens, right? That we like to look at the organization with a particular lens, and think about how that lens might interact with the discovery of what actually might be on the ground.
Yeah, it's a good term, and in fact, I like several lenses. Just a couple, for example, I like to look at some of these things from the lens of culture, structure, and politics. And I also look at another lens that Daniel Pink certainly popularized, if not invented himself, in autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Because there's a lot of motivation or damage to motivation that comes from those lenses. And if we have the wrong environment in place, those lenses will help us see that. And then we can make a correction to practices that actually works.
Yeah, I think the autonomy, master, and purpose thing, we've hit that when Steve McConnell was on the podcast. We had a particular key principle from his book, More Effective Agile, that really refers to Pink's work, and so there's a lot of linkage to that.
Yeah, and there's a tie, too, to the concept in More Effective Agile in the Cynefin framework that comes from David Snowden. And the notion here, each of these lenses I'm quoting has 3 elements to it, and those come basically after the triads in the sense-making method that Snowden does. When you ask somebody to rate the organization and place themselves in terms of people, process, technology, there is no right answer per se. So it isn't as simple as a strongly agree to strongly disagree question where somebody might be able to guess the correct answer in their mind or something. And I've actually had several people exclaim at the end of an interview that said, God, this is like therapy. And maybe it is in some sense, where people get to think differently about the organization across dimensions that undercut, underlie, or support everything that goes on above.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, you kind of alluded to this, but when we talk about these particular kinds of engagements with organizations, everything about that particular engagement ends up being customized. I mean, we don't have existing templates we use to force fit people into a particular organization, do a shortcut to work.
Right.
It's really all done specifically to them, much the same as you would be as a medical professional diagnosing an individual case, right?
Yeah, for sure. And that's one of the reasons I think that the term assessment has been rather sullied in the industry, is that there are groups out there that have maybe 4 or 5 canned reports, and the assessment consists of figuring out which one of those is the closest fit so they can shoehorn you into it. And then they'll change the name on the cover and put your logo on it and say, here, pay us. And they really haven't done any kind of deep assessment. It's just a first fit pattern match and they're done. Ours are custom, from the goals at the beginning all the way to the format of the report at the end. And that's a lot more work, but I can sleep at night knowing that we took a good, solid look at the organization as an organization. And we get, I think, far better recommendations from that than we would about saying, yeah, you look like this, so why don't you try that?
Yeah, it's the old diagnosis at a distance kind of thing, right? You just
exactly
don't do that, right?
Exactly. It was sometimes people say, just tell me what to do, and it's like, well, I can't. No more than a doctor would treat you over a telephone when they really need to get in and take a look at you before they can make a confident prescription. And to the degree that we want these recommendations to be specific and prescriptive and beneficial, we need to get in there and see this stuff. And it can't be something that's just done as some first fit pattern match or something done in a sort of general distant way.
Absolutely. So, you and I have been witness to a number of these engagements over time. And one of the things that I like to think about when I try and phrase this for folks listening to this podcast is that there are a lot of reasons why people ask for these particular engagements, right? I mean, it piques people's interests. Some people, in general, some people know something's wrong, right? A good manager or a lead might look at something and say, something's wrong here. I'd like some kind of validation from somebody outside this organization. Look in the box, tell us what's going on, right?
Right.
What are some of the other ways that people present themselves in terms of talking about that?
Well, I think that the reasons people come after assessments are probably as diverse as the organizations themselves. But that first category is a good one. Somebody says, I know something's wrong. And, I've been on both sides of this because I spending 17 plus years at Intel, I know how frustrating it can be in a company of any size when you know something is wrong and you tell folks that something is wrong and they don't believe you because you're not the expert, and you have to go in and have somebody from outside come in who's written a few books and say the exact same thing just so you can roll your eyes in the corner and say, can we move on now? And so, there is some of that. We know what's wrong and we need validation from outside. Other kind of categories, people may not know what's wrong. They may just sense something is off. Scrum has this in the sense of Scrum smells. There can be a smell going on. And somebody just says, I don't like the look of this. Or we joke about the horror films and things that you never want to do in a horror film, like say, I'll be right back. And you just know it's not going to end well.
That's right.
There are people who are looking around and saying, why did all the crickets just stop in this meeting? And something's going to burst through the door and eat them all anytime. So sometimes they know something is wrong, but they don't know what it is. What else? Other times, maybe you've just thrown groups together because we've done a merger. Somebody got bought by somebody else, and they didn't necessarily look at this in depth before they merged, and now they have to figure out, what do we do with this?
Yeah, I think that's a great that's a great thought. I mean, we have seen that time and time again. One organization had a particular flavor of Agile, for example. Another one was not doing that, and they pit against each other. And sometimes the internal management is even at odds with each other, trying to figure out, well, how do we get around this? We need to break the tie. And instead of the two of them going into a winner takes all arm wrestling match, they call somebody from the outside to say, hey, give us your best impression of what you think the go forward state should be here.
Exactly. And sometimes the problems run into that cultural layer too, because when you put these two organizations together, especially if they've got a lot of history in and of themselves, when they collide, it's not usually a nice clean fit, and something has to give in terms of decision making or just how they view the world, what's right, what's good, and those dimensions of culture that becomes so important.
Yeah, and I think, to take that to an extreme, you even have that in a monoculture, right? You could have a larger organization that has just grown over time and just had a striation of the practices, where you have some people doing things a certain way, some another. They might not all be reporting in the same organizational structure, but they may be building things that all roll up to one main product. And so you'd like to kind of harmonize that, right?
Yeah, it's kind of an organizational or cultural entropy, because once you get above a certain number of people, you can't say you know everyone well. And once that happens, you get subcultures and different organizations, silos perhaps, forming that go off and undergo some form of entropy, where they end up in a different place than the rest. And sometimes that's a great source of innovation and evolution. Sometimes it creates a lot of friction. So orgs can seek that clarity and say how best to harness what's going on and get ourselves pointed in a common enough direction to make rapid forward progress.
Yeah, I think that we see that quite often, and particularly working with larger organizations. That's when we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but a little bit more mechanically how we do these kind of things. But that actually has some bearing on the number of interviews we do in the organization, et cetera. But we can touch on that in a second. The one other thing I was going to raise, and this is sort of a human nature thing. I think people want to know that somebody else has their pain, right? So sometimes we get this question where people come in and they want a comparison to how are they doing against other organizations like ours? And the question might be phrased like, you're in a unique position to observe other people. We don't get a chance to look at other people, but you do. How do we look against them, right?
Exactly.
And it might not be the fact, even if they're having some horrendous issues, the fact that they hear somebody else has had the horrendous issues and there's a way out, right? That's a big deal for people to have that.
That's true. There is comfort in knowing you're not alone. It's not just us.
Yeah, right. You just want to know. Right?
The comparison idea also comes from a different thing. If you look at the work of people like Gerd Gigerenzer and this notion of heuristics, and you get it in Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow as well in the popularized versions of this notion of a heuristic, being able to compare yourself to somebody else can be a very good shortcut for making a difficult decision. Heuristics like take the best or imitate the successful. Because if you're in an unfamiliar environment, you think, how do I act? What do I do? One of the simplest ways to make decisions is do what the successful people are doing. And I think a lot of this curiosity we hear from people about what are other successful companies doing are exactly that heuristic. They're just looking for a shortcut and saying, I want to do what the other successful people are doing. The trick with heuristics is they don't guarantee that you're going to be successful. So imitating the successful is a nice strategy, but it's no guarantee that you also will be successful with that.
Absolutely.
And by the way, the next heuristic after imitate the successful, if you can't tell who is successful, imitate the majority. Do what most people are doing.
Right.
And that's why nobody ever got fired for buying IBM 30, 40 years ago, because everybody bought it. And, don't blame me. Everybody did it. Right. So these heuristics have some value. And the comparison to best practices, everyone's curious about how they stack up. But I think we're also not in the business of recommending that people just sort of emulate some narrow profile and try to define what everyone should be. That's a much more individual thing. And that's one of the powers of this form of assessment. We're not just wedging people into patterns.
Yeah, no, that's a great transition to this next topic. And the next key focus that we're going to talk about today, and we're just going to drop down into the weeds a little bit here, is really let's outline how we perform these engagements. What do they look like? And we're going to talk about that through a couple different areas: planning, information gathering, analysis, and the actual reporting process. And so, I typically in my role as a sales director here at Construx, I get involved early on with clients that come in and say we want someone to help us. And very oftentimes they're a little bit surprised that my first response to them, or my first question back to them, is, what's going on with your business? What's going on with the channel right now that's causing you to seek some help from the outside? And sometimes it's surprising to me that some clients might actually not have a quick answer for that. They start thinking, going, boy, that's really a good question. Here's the kind of things that I think are really helping or causing us to reach out to you, right? So defining business goals is sort of the first step we do in the planning process, right?
Yeah, it is. And you're right that a lot of people have not stopped to consider their broad goals. They come because they have symptoms, just like you go to the doctor because you have some sort of a symptom that's driving you crazy or causing you pain. So yeah, it is good to step back, and you do it rather well, to get these people to think in terms of much broader business goals. Because as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of cause lurking in things like culture and belief systems and trust. And so when somebody comes in and says, yeah, we keep having problems adopting and using Scrum effectively with new teams, fine, that's a symptom of something, but what? So the business goals are important there. And they also help focus the assessment, because somebody comes in and says, I don't feel good. And that's an awfully broad kind of introduction. And we need much more focus for the assessment than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the classic things that we hear from people is that, in today's marketplace, everybody's running, right? Running hard. There's competitors, and they're continually driving you with your solutions to the marketplace to get better, to be more varied, to have more complexity, to deliver more with less effort. So, the notion of improving time to market is something that we always hear people talk about, is that they have a current cadence that they're doing something with, and they just are looking for some ways to change that cadence, right?
Yeah, make it faster in response to competition. Time to market's been a force for a couple of decades now, as generation time from product to product, solution to solution has switched or gone down, and has switching costs have reduced. So people are no longer trapped in a system. Remember the days when you'd walk up to a desktop PC in the morning and you'd boot it, and then you'd load your enterprise application in about 90 seconds, and you'd work in it all day until you shut the PC down and went home. And nowadays, that's not true. And the switching costs from brand X to brand Y, especially in a cloud era, are so low that, TTM, what have you done for me lately, becomes a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the corollary to that might be the notion of agility, right? And the ability for someone in an organization to respond to a changing marketplace, right? You get lots of inbound requests for different industries or segments or things to support, and so trying to deliver to that broader marketplace with the same engine internally is a challenge. People need some thoughts about how to improve that ability, right?
They do. And that's one of the reasons I think that agility has been so prevalent within software, and now going beyond software into broader products and solutions. I think that the overall environment of increasing complexity out there of various forms and this pressure for time to market, software saw it first. And the Agile movement was a very good response to that kind of complexity because the old ways of front end first aren't going to work well there. But yeah, more and more companies are now in that business. We've been doing assessments with people who make physical things, right, made of metal. We had one client say, "Look, we grind metal for a living. We don't understand this software thing." And software wasn't just a part of their solution anymore. It had become the most valuable part. So folks who are used to a very front-end first manufacturing and design process are being confronted with all of this. So assessments on those grounds are pretty common.
Yeah. I mean, one of the big things that we hear from management is this notion of predictability of project delivery, right? I mean, the classic scheduler's nightmare of someone keep beating on someone. When am I going to get it? When am I going to get it? Right.
Right. And your sales folks want to be able to make promises to people because customers want these features. And yeah.
Right.
So predictability is important because if you keep saying we're going to do it and then you don't, these days, again, with low switching costs and rapidly emerging alternatives, it doesn't take much to get somebody to fly to a competitor.
Right. And related to that predictability thing is improving visibility. I mean, management, the old adage, management never likes to be surprised, right? If you continue to give them information and insight into what's happening, make things more visible in a dashboard kind of, a vision.
Sure.
That certainly helps them, right?
I might go you one better there and say management doesn't mind surprises if they come out early. What's deadly are the late surprises. Right. And we see a lot of this, again, back to a cultural layer to this. If bad news is punished, if the messengers get shot and things like that in a culture, then you end up with people postponing or burying bad news until it just can't be avoided any longer. And then it's too late to do anything about it. So improving visibility and control over projects. And that often involves making some changes to culture. Because if it's not okay to be visible at early status, and if it's not okay to experiment and fail, then you have a situation where you're just set up to promote late surprises that are going to be devastating.
Right, and that's one of the cultural eye openers for people who are adopting agile practices. Right, you need to have that permission to fail. That's an important thing. As long as you learn something from the process and keep moving forward, that's a culture that's, I think, it's something that we find hard for some organizations to grasp.
Yeah, and I've written about this in the value-driven delivery space. That organizations often have a team that starts with what's easy because it feels good and it seems like they're making rapid forward progress. All the lights are green, and they're doing everything that's precedented and easy. And then eventually they run out of that after some portion of the budget's been expended and the schedule's gone by. And then they start doing the hard stuff and you get that late surprise. So it's all about getting those things out early and ideally having greater predictability with time. So you've got to get those bad things out early and make sure you've made the right decisions there. Postponing them does great hurt. But we're drifting from assessment for sure there. But it is one of the reasons people bring us in because there's a lot of that going on. People don't feel empowered to bring that information out early. And Agile has every means by which to do that with short iterations, but it isn't happening.
Right. So, related to that, I think, is this idea that to release at a faster cadence to improve time to market. Some organizations clearly state in their business goals for assessment that they want to do those things, but not sacrifice quality. Right.
Well, of course, because
quality is still a big issue for them, and even improving quality. Right.
Right. Most people would just not say anything about quality, assuming that it stays the same. The magic here is that if you focus on quality, you will get short time to market. You will get high customer uptake and low defect rates in the field. If you don't focus on quality, all those things go away. You're not going to be predictable. You're going to have really upset customers, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a false dichotomy between things like speed and quality. If you want speed, focus on quality. And that's another pretty common theme in these assessments.
I think that's completely true. And I mean, I think you can maybe layer that under something called organizational efficiency. And we talk a lot here at Construx about this concept of rework. And when an organization is looking for incremental bandwidth to continue to deliver higher levels of business value out there, they're not aware of how much rework goes on internally, and whether
it's true, because it's invisible.
Yeah.
Software defects aren't in the factory with a red line painted around them with signs that say "Do not ship." Right? They're sitting in some database in bit storage. And so there again, we do work with some companies that are a more hardware-oriented company that sort of understands the concept of rework, but they have a hard time mapping it to this software thing that isn't on a pallet in the factory.
Right.
And even a lot of software, you end up with people who are culturally permitted or incented to ignore rework and just focus on velocity. Just go fast, because our definition of done doesn't include things like, do we have to fix it later?
Right.
Because we don't test before we check in. Oh my gosh, that's just a disaster waiting to happen when things like that happen.
I think that's true.
Yeah, so, Steve Talkie has written eloquently on this in his books and papers, and the idea that on all of the assessments I've been on, when we ask people, do you measure rework? The answer is almost always no.
Right.
And I say, do you have any data you can show me that your percentage of schedule and budget spent on rework is under half? The answer has only once been anything but no. We've had one client I can recall who measured rework at 38%, and I said, congratulations. The rest of them, I don't recall the last time anyone disputed it was at least 50%.
Yeah, it's more typical at that level. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, we don't want 0% rework, because then everybody is so afraid of creating rework that we make no forward progress. But 50%, 70, 75%, as I commonly hear people estimate on these assessments, that seems ridiculous in the other direction. So there's got to be something in that 10, 15, 20% range that allows for innovation and experimentation, but doesn't become a fiduciary nightmare when you think about how many people are doing the equivalent of sitting in a corner with the lights off because you've got 50% rework.
Right. I mean, we talked about this under the guise of technical debt on the last podcast with Steve, and some of the fall through discussions we had there were about intentional rework versus unintentional rework. Right.
Sure.
There are certainly times when you choose as an organization to do something, knowing that you're going to have to come back and revisit that, but you certainly don't want the rework to be there just because of stupid coding practices or the organization just shortcutting everything in a race to get to market. That's not healthy, and they don't understand. I think a lot of organizations don't understand how much of their bandwidth is consumed by people reworking stuff once they made those conscious decisions.
Right, because they're not measuring. So one of the healthiest things organizations can do here, as part of an assessment or not, is classify some rework. You can even take samples. You don't have to do everything necessarily. Just get some measurements and classify the rework according to a trichotomy from healthcare around quality assurance, and look at this and say, how much of the rework that we're doing is frankly preventable? How much of it is potentially preventable? And how much of it is unpreventable? And what you're just describing of intentional rework is this: it's unpreventable. We're going to go and do this because it's got other benefits that we're going to accept this one. The lean idea of necessary waste, whatever you want to do there. But I think a lot of organizations discover an alarming percentage of frankly preventable rework when they look at this, and that can be eliminated.
Right.
So go off and eliminate your frankly preventable rework, minimize your potentially preventable rework, and then create a process by which you can best handle the unpreventable rework. You know it's coming, so learn to work with it as well as you can.
Absolutely. So I think we kind of hit this planning aspect of it in terms of the initial business goals, and we find those conversations to be rather illuminating. They're good for both sides because we get some insight into what the organization worries about at a business level. And then we kind of use that as a lens, right, to kind of observe the organization. So when someone is asking about time to market, then we look at the organization with that kind of set of eyes in mind.
A focus, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So another thing that we do in the planning process that involves having to get deeper into the organization and get a better sense of what's going on is the notion of setting up individual interviews with the team members, right? And we do that either in going on site to an organization, or recently we've been doing this stuff more virtually. Talk about that interview selection process. What are we looking for? What would be important to know, or who would be important to talk to in an organization to get a better feel for what's happening on the ground?
Well, generally, we want a wide net within whatever bounds the overall goals of the assessment define. So obviously, since we're generally doing software-oriented stuff, we're going to get developers and we're going to get folks in QA and test. And if it's an Agile organization using Scrum, we definitely want to talk to some POs and Scrum Masters. But beyond that development team level, we also want to talk to management. And I'd like to talk to the people who are either the perpetrators or victims of things for the development team. Folks like marketing and operations, even sometimes people in HR and some of the legal environments. You never know. Sometimes the goals that an organization has take us into some pretty interesting places in the org. But we're going to focus on the people who create software and products, and then look around at beyond the boundary as to who they serve and what they're thought of by their customers and stakeholders inside and outside the org.
Right. And then in some cases, we'll ask the organization for some recommendations as well, right? Because they might actually have members on their team that they're really interested in hearing from them. And again, maybe going back to your cultural comment, sometimes there's particular individuals in an organization that are a little nervous about talking about things, but if you give them a safe place to correspond, right? We can kind of surface some things from these. Maybe they're low-level thought leaders that have a lot to say about things but have never been asked.
Yes,
right?
And we do try to make them comfortable in the interview. We guarantee confidentiality. There is no way that any of the information in raw notes ever gets shared back. Now, in a lot of organizations, to their credit, I've had people say, it doesn't matter. You can quote me if you want. Great. And I'm glad those cultures are healthy enough that things like that offered in the spirit of continuous improvement can be broadly acceptable. But there certainly have been places where I think anonymity was necessary to get real ground truth. And we also do that in that online survey that we'll talk about shortly. We got a lot of open comments in there. And you get to hear some pretty interesting things in those anonymous fields. Most people are not just getting bitchy about things and being nasty. It's really done in a constructive way, but it's done in a very frank way.
Sure. Well, let's hop into that, because the next thing I was going to talk about in terms of this structured set of practices that we do is this notion of information gathering, right? And so, the interviews are one thing. We also do, we cast a little wider net in terms of an organizational survey. Talk a little bit about that, the self-assessment idea.
Yeah, it does a couple of things. It gets more people involved and it gets a lot of subjects involved. So it's a nice way to get a picture of how the organization views itself. And generally, it only takes 30 to 45 minutes to fill this out for an individual, depending on how much they want to type in the open comments. Mm-hmm. But we get sometimes hundreds of responses that we can go through. And that's where a lot of the work is on our side, is that when you get that many comments, you've got to go through and do some coding and develop the themes that are coming out and see what is going on in people's minds there. But that kind of a survey is really valuable to us in figuring out what ground state is. Because if all I did was listen to the people who organized the survey and say, this is what we're doing, experience shows they'd be inaccurate most of the time. Right.
It's the difference between, yes, we're doing Agile to the organization, and then the team says, yeah, well, we don't do stand-ups, we don't do retrospectives, what we're doing Agile, right?
There's the policy manual, and then there's what actually happens on the floor, right? So everybody can say, yeah, this is the policy, but here's what really has to happen because this is broken and we have to do it this way.
Yeah, and one of the other things I think the survey and self-assessment thing can help us with is that there are times when we have the interview set that we're going to do, and something gets surfaced out of the self-assessment that says, we didn't really talk about that portion of the organization. We need someone from that group that's going to be in that set of interviews. And so there's some iterative aspects to our assessment work where it's not always a linear process right straight through. We might actually recurse a bit, right?
Indeed. And sometimes a topic will come up within the survey. I had one recently with effective meetings that came up in the survey that wasn't within the overall business goals, because the organization in that case, I think, was so close to the problem that it wasn't visible up front. But as they all started to individually respond, this issue emerged pretty strongly. So yeah, there is a two-way street there between the survey back to the interview selections and what we look at, even perhaps influencing the goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And another area that can be customized, I think, in the surveying process is this notion of, maybe the organization has some difficult questions they want to ask the broader environment, right? And they've been reluctant to do so, or they feel like they're not going to get answers back that are going to be candid enough. So we always offer that out to people, right? To say, hey, if you want to include some specialized questions in here, could even be domain related, where we're not really necessarily going to be the expert on that, but they want to ask the question during the process of surveying.
Yeah, for sure. And we have several people who've taken that opportunity.
Yeah. Absolutely. So another area that we in terms of preparation for this, when we're trying to assess the organization before we go on into the interviewing process, is this notion of getting a feel for what does the daily work look like. Give us some information about that, like some artifacts of the work that's being produced on a daily basis, just to get a feel for for the ground state. Tell us a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, we look at a wide array of artifacts, everything from product documentation to things like the backlog to various other essence, test plans, source code, all kinds of stuff, standards. Because what we're after is to figure out what really works in practice. Because again, we can have aspirational, we always do this, and the documents need to be at this level by this date, but those aspirations don't always hold up in real life.
Yeah, and I think it's really sometimes we've been pleasantly surprised by the amount of information that some of the clients give to us. Sometimes we've been really surprised that they can't produce a lot. And both ends of the spectrum are quite telling in terms of how we might approach the conversation, right?
It's true. And people can be uncomfortable with either too little or too much. We get a lot of folks in regulated industries who are sort of suffering under historical burden of how much documentation they have produced in the past. And they would like to be a little faster and a little more agile. And that's an entirely different situation than somebody who's trying to mature off of a startup phase into something larger and a bit more disciplined, looking for how to expand what they're putting down.
Right. I mean, you have that. I think there's kind of a natural occurrence in organizations that have been together for a long time, and they grow, and there are layers and layers of things that get added to the organization, and at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot of them that contribute to business value downstream, and so having a periodic way to kind of view that in an assessment context that says, are these things really needed anymore? Why are we doing this stuff? Is there a different way to think about how we might arrive at the same output, but not have that burden that's on us?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's something that any organization should be doing on a reasonably frequent basis, is looking at what it writes down and saying, who reads this and why does this content meet the needs of the people who will use it to do their jobs?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, that's the end of the day. That's what you're asking for. So, as part of the last phase of the information gathering thing is certainly the interview process, right? And so, we do those both either on site, person to person, sitting in a room with eyeballs on somebody, versus you've got some experiences doing this thing virtually, international and connecting. And so tell us a little bit about that process. How do you make people feel comfortable? What's your overall approach to the interview process?
Yeah, you're right, on-site or virtual, especially nowadays with Save the Planet and scary viruses. I think virtual is going to become even more frequent. And given the improvement in video conferencing, nothing will beat in the room with someone in terms of reading body language and communication bandwidth. But when you look at the cost of that and some of the other advantages to the virtual, besides just holding costs down and not creating CO2, there are some other flexible advantages for scheduling and things there too. So both of those are feasible. And I think we do pretty well with the video conferencing now for reading body language and creating an environment where there's enough trust and communication. One of the key elements, though, is that in these interviews, even though we have goals, which everybody knows, we don't hide the goals from anyone, and we have these areas of concern, let's say, what we don't do is walk into the interview with a list of 31 questions that we have created and put in the order we think is important. Instead, I use a much more ethnographically informed approach where I take a prompt of a very general nature and ask the interviewee, how do you feel about this or area? And is that the area you would have picked? Or it lets them go off into where they think the emphasis needs to be rather than just answering 31 questions in the order we impose them.
Right.
And I find that is incredibly enlightening. The number of topics that have come out of that open door approach rather than take a test, I would never do anything except that, because we've heard some startling things that didn't come out in the survey, that didn't come out in the planning. It's very interesting, So I my poker face is good, and I don't act surprised, but I take copious notes from all this. And at the end of this, you realize you've got a tremendous picture of what really matters to people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in addition to that, I don't want to say that we completely ignore the survey information and the information we get from management. I think we want to validate in some cases what we
exactly
we think we've assimilated, right? So, having them kind of do an open, here you're on the therapy couch, tell me what hurts.
Yeah.
And tell me what your mother did to you,
Right. Because these people have taken the survey. It's in their minds. So they already have the survey sort of biasing them into the areas of concern that we're after. So I don't think you need to be all that specific. I've never had a situation where somebody went into a completely irrelevant or inappropriate domain.
Right.
In the interview. So
that makes sense. And then, sometimes in the interview process, we have that's a part of the sequence that we go through. And, prior to doing the analysis, or maybe even going into the analysis, which we're going to talk about next, there may be some things where we say, you know what, I think we missed something. There's a person we didn't talk to that might have more data. So even the notion of things like follow-up calls and emails just to amplify or clarify things is a good thing to do as part of the practice, right?
Sure. And often at the end of 1 hour, people aren't done. It's pretty common to have somebody say, can I have a little more time? And sure, we'll accommodate that. And sometimes they'll wake up 2 days later and think, oh, I should have said, and they'll email or want a second call that way. And yeah, those follow-ups are pretty common, and they're always useful.
So in terms of cycle time, we didn't talk about maybe the meta picture here, but what is the duration of an assessment in terms of time? We're say that we've gone through this process of describing the business goals, and we've gotten the interview set up, and we've collected all this data. How far into this are we typically? What is an elapsed time?
Well, from a calendar perspective, it can be anywhere from a month to a bit less than that. And it depends on whether this is on-site or virtual. Mm-hmm. What we find is that the virtual assessments get started faster, because if you think about the logistics of the site visit, where we want to schedule 14 one-hour interviews back-to-back over 2 days, it's difficult to do that. And it takes time to get the emails sent around and to get people signed up for just the right slots and to arrange travel if need be to the home site or wherever we're visiting.
Or multiple sites, right?
Or multiple sites, right? So
Yeah.
all of those logistics can mean that the on-site assessment can take a little longer in lead time. The virtual assessments, we can put a spreadsheet out there with a bunch of available times in a shared location and let people sign up for it. We kick out video conference meetings, and we can get started within days of the kickoff talking to people. So generally, we're 3 to 7 weeks into this with an average of maybe a month.
Okay, well, that's helpful. And then, we're at the end of this information gathering process. We sort of start bridging into the analysis portion of this. And so we have, again, I mentioned before, we tend to adopt an agile practice in how we approach these particular assessments. And so the analysis is iterative, right? We'll tend to want to do things that we can get that information kind of together in a rough form and sort of tell the client, the sponsors, this is kind of the direction we're heading, right? And just to tip the hand a little bit and say this is kind of where we're seeing some things happen. So we do that by looking at sort of initial strengths and weaknesses, right? That's again against this lens of business goals.
Exactly. What did we see? What did they tell us? And can we correlate them?
Right.
And we talked earlier about why do people do the assessments? And sometimes people have a really good idea of what's wrong. Sometimes that idea is accurate. Sometimes it's not. So occasionally strengths and weaknesses come out to be a bit of a surprise to some folks who were driving the assessment. It doesn't always go the way they thought or anticipated it might. Mm-hmm. So one of my jokes here is that people often come to us and say, my leg hurts, I think I should take an aspirin. And we go off and do the assessment looking at leg pain and come back and say, yeah, we see why your leg hurts and why you want to take an aspirin. That's good. While you're at it, you may want to shoot the alligator.
Exactly.
Because there's a reason your leg hurts. And sadly, you didn't quite see that. So you bring the alligator to light and says, oh, there's an alligator on my leg. Maybe I should shoot it.
Right. So the strengths and weaknesses workup is really, it's I wouldn't say it's a sweetener kind of stuff. You're not trying to be pleasant to the client. You just kind of say, given our history of working with organizations, these are things that we think you guys are doing really well. Here's a bunch of things, right?
That's important because an assessment can't be weakness based, right? I remember annual reviews at a certain company I won't name where in my early years, in the first 5 minutes, they'd say, here's what you did well. And then they'd spend 55 minutes berating you for not being everything you weren't.
Right.
Rather than saying, let's focus on what you're really good at and make you even better. So yes, those strengths are important in this. Yeah, the recommendations and all the rest of that are also of primary concern, but we can't overlook the strengths the organization has because those are going to be important along the pathway to even better performance.
Well, you bridged into that the next idea, which is this notion of some preliminary recommendations, right? We work up the strength and weaknesses things. We get some idea of against business goals.
Right.
This organization's got to do some things differently. Here's some thoughts. Right.
Right. Natural flow because the recommendations don't come out of thin air. So absolutely. And why iterative? Because we know organizational history and culture could make certain things, certain phrasings. All I have to do is use the wrong phrasing, and it's going to send people off in the wrong direction and maybe completely scuttle a good recommendation just because it's worded in a way that the culture doesn't tolerate or can't understand. So the iterative nature of this allows us to go back and forth and make sure in our brief 2-month encounter with this culture, we're not saying something in a way that is ineffective.
Yeah, or even say we make some comment and they say, well, you didn't talk to this particular person. You should probably go back and talk about because we are doing some of that. It just isn't visible to you from what you saw, or
right.
Like
and
right?
Yeah, sometimes somebody says, I'm surprised you didn't say X, and sometimes we didn't say X because we are taking this limited focus look. And if we had more time and more depth, we would have discovered X. So sure, that iterative thing is also just a sort of a first level check on did we miss anything important just because of who we interviewed and what they happened to talk about on the day.
Totally. So when we structure the recommendations, we are generally going to do that in terms of things that are consumable by the client in a certain time frame, right? It's like sometimes there's some obvious things, right? They're just low-hanging, rotting fruit on the ground. Boy, you guys
I like the rotting fruit rotting on the ground. It's not just low-hanging fruit. It's actually rotting on the ground. If you don't eat it today, it's going to stink.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, certainly we want to time bias the recommendations so that we get a lot of bang for the buck right away. And there's another safety reason for that. Organizations change. And if all the recommendations are 4 years in duration, by the time people are 2 years in, it's going to be a very different world. So we need to emphasize the near term and what can be done there.
Right. So, big bang, like things that with a lot of, high level of return for a small amount of investment would go into a category of short-term recommendations. And those are typically things that an organization should be able to do within 60, 90, 120 days, right? Something like that.
Exactly.
Typically.
Exactly. I like the big R on little I. What are the things that really do provide a disproportionate return on investment?
Right. And they tend to be also, I think we priority weight them in terms of the most urgent and important items too. So those are things that people need to fix. If you're against the lens of the business goals that the client has articulated, these are the things that you really need to get on right now.
Well, yeah, and frankly, this has all the complexity and nuance of managing a backlog for anything else. There are the factors of importance and urgency, and there's sequential dependencies, and so that's another reason this is a nice iterative process, because you could wish to do things in a certain order and do certain things within 30 or 60 days. The organization may come back and say, brilliant idea, but clearly infeasible.
Yeah, absolutely. And there, like we find so many times, there are some complex issues that build on each other, right? So one of the things I think that we have talked about a lot over the years with all of our clients is the notion of the ability of any organization to absorb change.
Yeah, there's a paper towel metaphor, right? And which paper towel can absorb the most change. And you can do things to improve an organization's ability to absorb change, but every organization has this intrinsic limit beyond which people just get paralyzed, or their eyes glaze over, or they run away in fear. So we have to pace the change according to let's keep the trains running on time and all those other metaphors.
Sure. I mean, the longer term items are dependent upon some shorter term items. So you have to sequence them because they have things that are happening downstream. Sometimes, organizational change has to occur. And boy, that's not a short term thing, right?
Right. Changing organizations, especially in large orgs, can take months to prepare for. And of course, changing culture can take even longer than that, because culture just is what it is, right? It's not a simple thing to change.
Yeah. I mean, these outputs will run the gamut between, tactical kinds of things that people need to do if they're not doing retrospectives, for example, or things like that, versus strategic things that the organization setting direction has been pretty poor. And so sometimes that cultural thing that gets surfaced in the interviews that, management doesn't tell us what the heck's going on.
Yeah.
Those are changes that an organization needs to do from a strategic standpoint moving forward, is to continue to keep people involved in the business and making them aware of what the business is doing. And that it's surprising to me in my years of working with organizations how often that comes up as a problem that people just don't have the connectivity to the business, the buy-in, right?
Yeah, or they don't have a consistent view of strategy and all of that. Yeah, those are common organizational issues.
Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to touch about in the mechanical aspects of what we're doing is just the notion of the presentation of findings, right? Because that's, the whole goal of this whole thing is to come back to the client with this report in some format, right? So tell me a little bit about that process. How do you think about that, and what's important to you in terms of setting that up?
Well, we do have a template for the order in which these topics get presented, from the strengths and weaknesses down to the recommendations and et cetera. We always start with the short-term recommendations and move on from there. So there is that to work from. But after that, because all of these are custom, there's a lot of work to do to prepare this. And that, again, is done iteratively. I already mentioned the need to frame things like strengths, weaknesses, and recommendations in the language and conceptual framework that the organization itself will understand and be able to act upon. We also have to make sure that the report and its recommendations reflect all the organization's realities and so whatever opportunities they bring to light, like, oh yeah, and by the way, we are planning to do a reorganization 6 months from now anyway. So we need to know those sorts of things as we write the report. So it can be a presentation, it can be a Word doc. I tend to use Word to get very specific in the recommendations. Sometimes a group will prefer a presentation so that they can just go off and show it to lots of people. Whatever the client prefers is fine with me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think those are The choice is up to the client. For years we did these big, heavyweight, long 70, 80-page reports that we would give to the senior management, and 3 of them would read half of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the TLDR generation, right? It's
right.
I'm not going to read any more than 22 seconds.
Right. So some of the more recent ones have been more involved in very focused presentations where people just are looking for the bottom line, and more of the information is transferred verbally in the report out structure, right? Whether we do that on site or whether we do that virtually as well.
Exactly. And whether or not people choose to bring us in for an action planning workshop after the assessment. The assessment can end with the presentation of findings. Done, fine, go off and do your work. And sometimes very large, mature organizations that have groups specifically dedicated internally to making these things true will just go from there. But often we're called in after this to do a day or two as a workshop to say, all right, we buy the recommendations. Now what? How do we do this? Let's get tactical. So some of the length that might have shown up in an earlier assessment report can be shunted to the planning workshop, and where people can get into the background at great depth and tactical steps for what to do next.
That makes total sense. So that's going to bring us to the last focus area that we're going to talk about today, which is really the results, right? And that's really what this is all about. So everything that we do in these assessments, everything that we talk about, is very highly specific to the client in question. They're very customized, very targeted. But so in terms of giving some like sample examples, there's not a whole lot we can share that's specific, but we can do some general general conversation about some of the things. So tell me something like in a technical sense, something that you would maybe surface after looking at an organization. Give me an example of that.
Yeah, these tend to be some of the quick hitters. It's nice when you run into an issue where the cultural support is there and management wants to do it well, and the only gap is a technical sort of shortcoming in a practice. Let's see, a good example might be coming away from an assessment where a company says we're doing Scrum, but then when you get in and go through the artifact reviews and the surveys and the interviews, you realize, well, they're really not. They've taken a cafeteria approach. It's very uneven. It's partial. There's role confusion. Various things like this come up pretty frequently. And in the sense that everybody from management on down wants to be doing Scrum, and they're just not being very effective at it, it's a relatively simple fix to recommend something like a Scrum tune-up or some baseline training to get everybody on the same page for what Scrum really is, how to do its practices well, and then what this organization's approach should be universally to get started.
Right. I mean, it makes total sense. Give me an example of something at the organizational level that you might uncover or talk about, right?
Well, there have been several interesting ones lately. I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies that are not software companies traditionally are being all but forced to become proficient at having software-based ingredients in their solution. Sometimes those new software ingredients become the most profitable, most important ingredient in their traditional solution. So how to organize and communicate in such organizations, because we've got decision-making and power and authority used to be focused in the hardware component world. But now these upstart software people are in here. I don't understand what it is they do. They use funny words. Those people, they talk really strangely, and they eat a lot of pizza. And
you eat a lot of everything, and they drink a lot of
everything. Yeah, it's the coffee alcohol cycle.
That's right. Exactly.
So there can be a lot of things for how to work within the organizational structure that now includes software. Or organizations may be expanding, acquisitions or just organic growth, and now they've got multiple sites and larger teams. Or perhaps they're in the midst of some form of agile transformation. And the Agile Boundary, which you can read about in Steve's book, More Effective Agile, this notion of the part of the organization that's inside the Agile Boundary and working that way already, like your Scrum teams, and the part that's outside the Agile Boundary. Maybe you've got sales and marketing that's still working in a more traditional sequential way. And the recommendations may be, let's move the Agile boundary in some way that brings some or all of a new function or department inside of it so that we get better overall value, throughput, and time to market gets reduced, all those good things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Agile Boundary is a great subject, and maybe we can put that on the table for a longer dive at another time. But I think you have a lot of things to say about that, and it's an important aspect of organizational structure too. So
yeah, in terms of transformation, it was one of the most powerful concepts that I used in my former career back at Intel. Was this notion that we were bringing Agile software into a company that was a powerful manufacturing entity and had a long history of that manufacturing genetic makeup. So it was very much a notion of moving the boundary hand over hand into places where it supported better software development.
Absolutely. It's okay, Mr. Producer, put a note on the board. We'll add that to our Kanban board. Give me something. Give me another recommendation that you might think about doing that might have something to do with culture. Give me a cultural kind of an idea that you might surface.
Yeah, these get nuanced, and of course I want to be careful here because they are often so specific that if I say too many words, I'm likely to call out a little too much.
Right.
And I don't want to do that. So now, a lot of people who are listening probably know that OKRs have become very popular these days, especially among management, as this way to make everything better. We see a lot of need within the space people are trying to affect with OKRs, generally getting more quantitative in the way they specify a product in terms of success and objectively measuring where are we. The predictability thing you mentioned early on is one of the goals, right? We get a lot of people who say we need to be more predictable. And then a cultural aspect of predictability is a pretty frequent result of that in the recommendations for, all right, we need to create a culture that supports predictability in terms of being able to quantitatively define success and failure and very objectively say, this is what we're going to do. And it helps with the alignment you talked about, where people don't understand a strategy and start pulling in the wrong directions because the strategy is specified vaguely or qualitatively, and folks misinterpret the true intent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good example, I think.
And trust is another one. There's a lot of people with size or distance or the new guys being software again. There's a lot of issues with trust out there. So we often end up doing recommendations on tactical things to improve trust across groups, things like social network stimulation and other ways of cross-pollinating groups and sort of breaking down that us versus them mentality, even if you preserve silos. As various smart people are writing now, silos aren't always bad. Mm-hmm. And I think this universal goal of eliminate all silos is probably a huge mistake. But we have to be able to work effectively with the silos that we have and deal with the identification that comes with that. And me versus you and us versus them gets unhealthy in various aspects. So working in trust in the organization, even while recognizing team identity and all the rest of that, that's another very common and nuanced way to look at the recommendations.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we can rattle on forever about a lot of stuff that we've seen. There's all kinds of things you've done around requirements management practices and organizational structure alignment and things of that nature. But I think at this point we are going to have to call this a wrap, right, Mr. Producer? I think we're at the edge of our time. We actually are way over our edge of our time. But this is a topic I think that both you and I, Erik, really feel pretty passionate about. It delivers a lot of value to the clients we work with, and so I think it's. Yeah. I want to thank you for bringing your wisdom and your insight to a really important topic. And I think we'll have you back again, hopefully for another chat. We talked a little bit about maybe the Agile Boundary being a one. Certainly you have a lot to say about the notion of metrics and objectively measuring success and failure. That's another topic we might do. But we might even come back and talk about hazy IPAs, right?
You might, or in my case, fruit sours. More sour, more better, baby.
Awesome. That sounds good. Anytime there's beer involved, I'm on the table. So thank you again, sir.
Yeah, and if someone listening to this has an idea for where they want to hear more, then I'm always up for that, right? We can speculate and we can throw stuff out here, but listeners, why don't you tell us what you want to hear next?
Absolutely. Anyway, I think that's it for today. Be sure to tune in again for another episode of Inspect and Adapt, the Construx podcast. Until then, this has been Mark Griffin as your host. Liz Ostaszewski has been our audio engineer, and Devin Musgrave today is our producer. Have a great next sprint. If you enjoyed this episode and you have comments or would like to talk with one of our practitioners, reach out via email using comments@construx.com. Again, that's comments@construx.com. We'd love to hear from you.